Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Rossen, and I'm Vice President of the DESARA Group. Thanks for joining us today. I see people calling in from all over, lots of familiar names. We'll get started in just a minute as people are dialing in. Just want to remind people that the session is being recorded, and so all participants will be muted until the discussion at the end. Today's webinar is being presented by Joe Barckett. And Joe's actually flipping the slides right now, so I just got a little confused there when I couldn't flip. There you go. Today's webinar is the next one in our Key Concepts series. It's on documented information, objectives, and policy. Now, on the next slide, it shows most of you are probably already familiar with how to use the controls on GoToWebinar, but if you've got a big panel showing there on the right, you may want to click that little orange button as shown on the screen there to minimize that control panel. Click the orange button again, it'll open back up, and you can click any questions and answers. Go ahead and ask your questions throughout the webinar. If you can note the page number they're on, that'll be helpful at the end, and I'll read those out to Joe. Your questions will not be revealed to everyone on the line. I'll be the only one who can read those. Joe and I will be able to read those. Let's see, you can make the presentation full screen if it's too small on your screen with that little button there, the little full screen icon under the orange arrow. You can also raise your hand if you need to ask a question. It's probably better to just go ahead and type that question in since we are muted. We use that more in our live virtual classrooms. In a minute, we'll get into the content about today, and Joe, you can show the agenda for the day next. We'll start out with a little bit about the DESARA Group, and then we're going to cover 3 topics today: 5.2 policy, 6.2 quality objectives, and 7.5 documented information. Within each section, Joe will give a summary of what you should do about that piece of information. So you'll get this information all as a recording after the webinar. You'll get a link tomorrow or the next day that'll say where to go to get the recording. You can take some notes or some screenshots during the presentation today. Now, the DESARA Group was started in 2008 by consultants with over 20 years of industry experience, and what we've been doing is working with clients over these last years to implement standards-based management systems. We do ISO 9001, TL 9000, AS 9100, and we're in information security, ISO 27001 right now, doing more and more information security management work. So we provide consulting services to improve the business as well as training solutions to help companies get up to speed on what they need to know. So right now in this transition time, we're doing these educational webinars for our clients and folks that we'd like to have become clients, and we only put the recording up for 2 to 3 weeks at the end because we'll probably go ahead and revise the presentation the next time we give it. And we want you to, if you didn't get to, for people who didn't get to, okay, sorry, I got a text there I had to read. For people who didn't get to watch it, we want them to watch it promptly and don't say, oh, I'll get around to watching that one day soon. Joe just asked me, are we recording? We are in fact recording, Joe. You don't need to worry about that. Although he's afraid I'm going to make him redo it.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. So you can change the slides, Joe. We have been doing a lot with clients on ISO 9001 2015 transition, and I will give you some information about that at the end. And now a little bit about our presenter. Joe Barckett is a senior consultant and Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt with the DESARA Group. He's got a long list of business and individual black belts. He's coached to millions of dollars in savings. But the root of all those savings has been having baseline processes that are in control. And that's what ISO 9001 should allow companies to achieve. So while Joe is an expert in using business improvement methodologies, he started out his career early on with working with many, many companies implementing management systems. When he walks into business, whether manufacturing or service, to improve their effectiveness, he immediately recognizes the state of their quality management system overall, and sometimes they have to get back to the basics. So he's got deep reserves of knowledge on all of this. And he's worked in manufacturing and service industries, and I just love hearing the wealth of knowledge that he brings. Anyone who gets him on site as their consultant for a project, you're really lucky. So I'd like to hand this over to Joe to begin the presentation today.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone. As is typical, we are going to talk about the new standard today, and we've got 3 sections we want to spend time on. Karen already spoke briefly about them, the 5.2 policy, 6.2 quality objectives, and 7.5 documented information. It's interesting when we started to put these key concept series together, it was interesting for us to figure out what should we group together, what 2 or 3 things should we talk about during the actual webinar. And these, to me, seem to go together fairly well, and so we decided that these were the 3 that we would spend some time on today. So our first point of discussion today is the policy, 5.2. One of the first things you may or may not notice is that it doesn't say quality policy in the title. The old section used to say quality policy in 2008. So I think this is an attempt in this section to make it a little bit easier for us to integrate the quality management systems of environmental health and safety. Every one of those standards will have a policy section in 5.2, and to put quality in the title probably takes away from that. So let's talk about policy. One of the things that 9000, the new 9000 standard, has done for us is it's brought 20 pages, 20 pages of definitions for us to use where there were none before in 2008. And the definition of policy in that standard 9000 talks about intentions and direction of an organization as formally expressed by its top management. So we're looking at what are the intentions of the business, what's the direction the business is going in, and who's giving us that direction and intention? It should be top management. Again, there were no definitions in the 2008 standard, and so we've got something at least to hang our hat onto. There's also a definition for quality policy in there. So 5.2.1 talks about now establishing that quality policy. They put the words up front. I've highlighted in red some of the new terminology, some of the new words that have made it into the new standard. 2008 essentially had 4 bullet points that we were talking about. They're all here. They're just different formats and different phrases. The 5.2 section has been beefed up quite a bit. So if we step through some of these bullet points, we'll get some feel for what the detail that's been added. Top management shall establish, that wasn't even in the old standard, implement and maintain a quality policy. So again, we're making top management a little bit more accountable. For your internal auditors, this is good news because now they have a place to go directly in the standard that says when they talk to top management, this is your responsibility. It's your responsibility to establish a quality policy. It's your responsibility to implement that, and then it's your responsibility to maintain it over time. So it gives us, as auditors, both internal and external, a little bit more to hang our hat on. As we step through the individual bullet points, the new words show up again in the red. The policy should be appropriate to the purpose. That was in the old standard. And now we've added it. Appropriate to the context of the organization. Remember the context back in 4.1? So we want this policy to be appropriate to the context of the organization, whatever that context is, technological context, financial context, all the things that we talked about when we talked about 4.1, and supports its strategic direction. So I should be able to make a linkage between this quality policy and the strategic direction of the company. Again, it gives us as auditors something to look for. What is the linkage? What's your quality policy? Show me how it links to your strategic direction of the organization. B has always been there, provides a framework for setting quality objectives. We'll get to quality objectives in a minute. We've had discussions about this time and time again. What does that mean? Provides a framework. Well, if you think about it, it's trying to tell us that all of our quality objectives should be able to be linked back to this quality policy. We've always told you that the quality policy, anything in your quality policy, is auditable. Now, with this framework, which has been there before, we're basically saying that we need to have quality objectives that are tied back to this framework. Way back when we did our first webinar, we talked about how the standard has morphed over the years from product. The first 2 sets of the standard were product-oriented. The second 2 revs were process-oriented. And now this 3rd rev, major rev, is performance-oriented. And so what we're trying to do here again is to beef that up, making sure that our quality objectives have relationship to our policy. Why have them if they're not related to our quality policy? The third bullet includes a commitment to satisfy, and this says applicable requirements. And so that's a new word for us. The old standard said that we would have satisfy requirements. Now we say, what are the applicable requirements? Believe me, I think it's an effect, in essence, to try and expand that again to the interested parties and not just keep it to customer requirements. And then D, which has always been in there, includes a commitment to continual improvement of the quality management system. So if most of you did what we probably saw in hundreds of companies, is take the 4 bullet points from 2008 and just essentially spit them back as your quality policy, this is asking you to do a little bit more than that. 521 talks about top management, it talks about context, and it talks about strategic direction. They go on a little bit more. They've added at least 3 more bullet points in 522. It says communication. Communication was simply a line item in 2008. Now it has its own subclause with these 3 bullets and a lot of new words associated with it. Again, the highlighted red words are new. Available documented information. So we see this term documented information again, and we've talked about it, I think, when we did the first webinar, and we'll see it again when we get to section 7. And so what they're saying here is that we want this quality policy to be documented somewhere. Now, documented information can take a lot of different forms. It can take electronic formats, it can take paper formats. You decide what documented information is. However, it needs to be available and maintained. Essentially, we want to make sure that it's controlled, that we have the correct quality policy out there. B talks about the communication piece. We've always had communicated and understood, and now they've added the words and applied within that organization. So we want to make sure that people understand what the quality policy is throughout the organization, and we want to make sure that that quality policy, whatever is in there, has some application within that organization. So again, tying them back to the quality objectives, which we'll see in a little bit. And then C, be available. They've spelled it out to relevant, interested parties. And they've added the words as appropriate. Again, who decides that? You decide who the relevant, interested parties are. You've done that basically from 4.1, and now your job is to make sure that this is available to them as is appropriate. Do you need to make it available to the surrounding community? Well, if it's appropriate for you to do that, yes. But you make that decision, the as appropriate. You decide that. So those are the 2 sections in the policy piece that relate to the quality policy, communication and who needs to do it. We're going to review these slides probably at the end again, but I want to talk a little bit about what it is you should be doing based on that discussion. First off, obviously you should be reviewing your current policy. Look at it in the context of the organization. Look at it from the strategic direction. And what you're trying to decide is, are we consistent? Is this consistent from the policy to the context, from the context to the strategic direction and back? We want to make sure that they line up together. You know, Deming always talked about constancy of purpose. This is part of that. What's our policy? What's our strategic direction? And clearly, what is the context of the organization? Do they line up? The second thing I think that you should be thinking about is, as with 2008, you want to check consistency of this policy against your quality objectives. Can I take each and every one of those quality objectives and bounce it off something that's in my quality policy? If I can't, do I need to have that quality objective as an objective this year? The third thing, we're going to talk about quality manual when we get to documented information. But my guess is you're going to have some document called a quality manual. And this probably should be part of it. This quality policy should be something that's probably going to be in that new quality manual. If you think of the new quality manual as a document that is useful to your employees, this would be one of the things that would be useful to have in there. What is the quality policy? The fourth one talks about how are we going to effectively communicate it. So we need some sort of action item to make sure that we effectively communicate this policy and changes to the whole organization. And it's not just a communication, It's an understanding of the quality policy. So in your all-hands meetings, in your morning meetings, in your reviews, your management reviews, your operational reviews, it might be worthwhile to talk through this quality policy, what it means to the organization, how it ties into the context, and how it ties into the strategic direction, so that people understand it. We've always had the ability as auditors to approach anyone in the organization and ask them, what's your quality policy? We never expected them to memorize it, obviously, but they should know where to go. They should be able to explain it and show that they understand how that applies to them. So if we look at Karen's 6 steps to the transition that she talked about in one of the webinars, what we think you should do here is clearly make the high-level actions part of that step 3, the high-level plan. And then in step 5, get down into the details of what actually needs to be done for each and every one of those high-level plans. All right, that wraps it up for 5.2. I want to remind you, type your questions in, and if they relate to a specific page in our presentation, the page number is down on the bottom. Please reference that, and we can flip back to that page and answer your questions as we move forward. We've talked a little bit already about quality objectives, so 6.2 states that. The next section is quality objectives. Interestingly enough, it's part of the new Annex SL Section 6, Planning, and it shows up after 6.1, which is the new section on risks and opportunities. And so to me, that indicates that in developing our quality objectives, we should take those risks and opportunities into consideration and maybe make some of those part of the quality objectives. Karen's got a poll for us. Karen, can you pull that poll up before we go on and do the actual requirements piece? I can't hear you, Karen, if you're there. Well, maybe we don't have a poll.
How's that?
Maybe.
Did the poll come up?
I don't see it on my end.
Poll, there it is.
You scared me there for a minute.
I had muted myself and I was talking to you and I couldn't find the button. Now you can see the poll, right, Joe?
No, I cannot. It says poll open. Hang on, let me look at my tab.
So what do you think are the most common weaknesses in objectives for quality? And this is anybody, y'all can punch your stuff in here. We've got very few people have voted so far. Here they come. Go ahead and enter. When I see just about everybody's put their thoughts in there.
So I can see the results, Karen.
Can you see on your screen under the polls tab? You can see that
Yep,
we've got
I can see the results.
People voted or so. Okay. And we'll give this a few more seconds. So too many are not enough. We
always find that quality objectives are an interesting discussion when we go in and do internal audits. So it's interesting to see your responses here.
Yeah. Okay. That looks like just about the voting slowed down. I'm going to close the poll in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Closing the poll, and I'll share the results. Joe, can you see the shared results there on your screen?
I can see the results. So what we've got basically is we've got at least half of you say that the objectives can't be measured. And that's going to be interesting because as we get into the requirements, we're going to talk about measuring those results. It's always been a requirement in the standard, but it has a little bit more kick behind it now. The next highest, about a quarter of you, listed as no consequences for meeting them. So no accountability, nobody's on the hook for that. And then the rest is spread between too general, too many or not enough, and expecting perfection, which is the lowest category there. So that's interesting to know. All right, let's head on over into the actual requirements. In 5.4.1 of the old standard, we had 2 sentences that talked about quality objectives. And it basically said top management shall establish them at relevant functions, relevant levels, and they shall be measurable and consistent with the quality policy. And that basically was it. 2015 has definitely put more teeth into them. Remember here we're talking about objectives. We're not talking about goals. And so that's significant for us. If we go back to our friend 9000 with definitions, there are two definitions to be looked at. One is objective and one is quality objective. The definition for objective says results to be achieved. And my goodness, there's a ton of notes that are assigned to that. Take a quick walk through the notes. They talk about objectives can be of three types: strategic, tactical, and operational. Note 2 says they can relate to different disciplines. So again, this is, I think, an attempt to make sure that we look at the interdependency on our management systems: quality management system, financial management system, environmental management system. We're strictly in our standard 9001 talking about quality objectives, not worried so much about the others. Note 3 talks about other ways they can be expressed, and Note 4 brings into the discussion the context of the quality management system, how they're set by the organization, and again consistent with the quality policy. Most of these things will make their way into the requirements. Note 5 talks a little bit about Annex SL and the fact that they're common terms and core definitions. If we go back to 372, the definitions in ISO 9000, there's a definition for quality objective, and basically it's telling us that it is a result to be achieved objective as related to quality. And so again, based on the organization's quality policy. And then they're generally specified for functions levels, and a new word in this note, processes within the organization. So again, most of these will make their way into the requirements, which are on the next page. Because these are objectives and not goals, every time I hear the term objectives, I think of the acronym SMART. And most of you hopefully have heard of this: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And as I walk through the requirements, I'm going to show you where these SMART criteria show up in each of these. They don't specifically spell them out in some cases, in other cases they do. But I want to make sure that you've got a fairly clear understanding that they're headed in this direction, that they're looking for objectives to have these types of characteristics. The first requirement is in 621. And it says basically that the organization shall establish, that's a new word, quality objectives. The old 541 said ensure quality objectives, but now we say establish them. Establish quality objectives of relevant functions. There's the relevancy. And so quality objectives, relevant functions, and levels were there before. The new terminology is and processes. They've added the term processes. They expect us to look and see, should we have quality objectives at the processes? Again, it's an attempt to focus us on this process approach. If you remember way back in section 4, we had talked about process management sheets, SIPOC, turtle diagrams, whatever you want to call them. And if we look at our business as a series of those processes, what they're integrating here is that they would like objectives for those processes, not just at relevant functions and at levels, but at those key processes that we have spelled out in our interaction and relationship chart. If we move on to section and look at the bullet points, it talks a little bit about each of those quality objectives, and I've put in a SMART stamp and a circle to show which one of those SMART stamps they're actually getting at. The first one, from the old standard, consistent with the quality policy. Consistent to me means specific. We want to be specific and tie it in with that quality policy. Measurable, they've used the actual word from SMART. It's measurable. C, takes into account applicable requirements. The old 541 said product requirements. Again, they've expanded this to talk, I think, more about interested parties, not just customer requirements. D, they use the term relevant from the SMART acronym. Relevant to the conformity of products and services and the addition to enhancement of customer satisfaction. So we're trying to make a relationship or a tie-in back to that customer-focused quality principle that the standard is built on. So right off the bat, we've got measurable, we've got specific, and we've got relevant from the SMART criteria already hinted at, and in some cases spelled out specifically. If we continue down on those 7 bullet points, The quality objectives shall be monitored, communicated, and updated. New words for us. It's not good enough just to have a quality objective anymore. Somebody's got to be looking at it. Somebody has to communicate it to the organization so that the organization understands what the quality objective is. And then they have to update it as appropriate. If for whatever reason those quality objectives become outdated, they become obsolete, products disappear, processes go away, these quality objectives need to be updated. Who decides what's appropriate? Again, the company decides what it is. The last sentence here says the organization shall maintain documented information. So that means there has to be some place where we can go look at them. Again, whether it's electronic, whether it's written, or any other media that they choose to use, it has to be maintained as documented information. So there's a lot more detail here in those 7 bullets than there were in the section 5.4.1 in 2008. However, we're not done yet. This communicated piece, which had a sentence in the old 5.41, now has 5 more bullets. When planning to achieve the quality objectives, the organization shall determine what's going to be done, that's new, what resources are going to be required, who's responsible, when it's completed, and how they're going to be evaluated. So what, again, drives to the specific? Resources drives to the achievable. Do we have resources to make this thing achievable? Who's going to be responsible gets us accountability. Management, top management, again, is held more accountable. When's it going to be completed gets us to the timeliness of the SMART criteria. And how the results are going to be evaluated gets us a little bit to the achievable. Now, I had to stretch a little to get the attainable or achievable piece in there, but I got them all. These 7 bullets, in addition to these 5, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound, are really talked about, even though in some cases they're not spelled out in those words. So there's been a lot more detail added to these quality objectives than in 2008. And that speaks to our comment in the other webinars that this standard is a lot more performance-oriented than the other standard has been. Not that we couldn't do that in 2008, it just, again, gives your internal auditors a lot more meat to chew on when they're doing their internal audits. Again, if you have questions for us, make sure you put them in the question tab so we can answer them as we go forward. Now, what would I expect to see as an auditor coming into an organization as it relates to quality objectives? Here's an example. I want to stress up front, this is not a requirement that you have this table. But here's an example of something that might be useful for the organization and at the same time meet the requirements in the standard. We've got column 1, the high-level strategic goals. As an example, maintain our current industry lead in quality, increase revenue by 10%. Most of you go through an annual planning session, and strategic goals are either generated or reviewed and updated in that annual planning session. If that planning session is effective, what typically comes out of that are a series of annual goals for this year, annual objectives. What are we going to do to meet those strategic goals? And that's what it is in column 2. For example, for our maintain current industry lead, we might have an objective that says increase first pass yield from 3.2 sigma to 4.0 sigma in the packaging process. Very specific, measurable. Whether it's attainable or not, we can have a discussion. Relevant to the business because it relates to that strategic goal of maintaining our current industry lead in quality. And time-bound. If you look at the 5th column, it has a completion date of the end of the year. The 3rd column talks about families of measures. Some of your objectives, some of your strategic goals aren't going to be quality related. They might be financial related. They may be productivity related. They may be cycle time related. And so that column allows us to highlight which of those PFQT, those families of measures, these objectives are related to. From the 9001 standpoint, we're interested in those that are related to quality. The 4th column tells me who's responsible. Joe B. with his packing team, Sandra with the design team, Pat with the product A sales team. We have a completion date. And the last column talks about what's the evaluation tool. How are we going to keep track of this metric? In this particular case, we're going to have a daily control chart that's going to be looking at either yields or sigma values, whatever the key metric is going to be there. For the increase the CPKs, we're going to be looking at a monthly CPK calculation. For the revenue, we might have a monthly run chart. So again, this is something that your employees can use to understand the business a little bit better and understand where they fit into that business. Not a requirement. Please do not walk away thinking that you have to go and do this matrix. It's not a necessity from the standard, but it's a tool that you might be able to use to meet the requirements of the standard. All right. As is always the case, one of the things that we do at the end of the discussion here is talk about what should you do moving forward. What is your action as you go forward in this process of transition? And again, I'll tie it back to Karen's 6 steps. So from this clause 6.2, quality objectives and planning to achieve them, I think there are 3 high-level things you need to be thinking about. Clearly reviewing those quality objectives and making sure that they meet those SMART criteria, as well as any other criteria that's in the standard: who, what, where, how, and when. Review how you're monitoring and measuring those quality objectives. I can't tell you how many times we go into organization, and yeah, they have quality objectives, but they, as you noted, they can't be measured, or they are measuring them, but nobody's looking at the data, or they're not even measuring them. They're out there, somebody put them out there in January, and nobody has a clue where they're at in July. So make sure you review those quality objectives, how you're monitoring them on an ongoing basis, what the key metric is, and how you're tracking that key metric. And then, as important, as we'll see once we get to section 9 in the performance, when we do that on our key concept series, how are you analyzing that data? What are you doing with it? And then what are you doing with the results of that data? So put them in the high-level plan, and then make sure that they're very specific in the action plans so that somebody has responsibility to do each and every one of these activities. All right. That brings us to another poll. Karen, are we good for the second poll?
We are. Here it comes.
Okay.
I'll launch the poll. And it says, what percentage of professional and managerial employees, we wanted to ask it that way because we figure you guys on this call are pretty much in those ranks. And of course, we want goals to flow down further through the organization. But just looking at among the professional managerial employees, how many know their quality goals and performance? So throughout your company, where would you say you stand? Okay, we're seeing these come in. I'm expecting that, my guess is that we've got the folks who are on a transition call this early in the transition cycle have pretty strong quality management systems in their companies, and we'll see some high numbers here. I'm going to close the poll.
I feel like I'm in CNN or Fox News watching the results of the New Hampshire primary.
Yeah, you and I can see them roll in. It's not nearly as exciting, but in fact, it's kind of funny how these rolled out. Joe, being a statistician, had a problem, I'm sure, with how I laid out those rankings. They weren't even 20%, but I did that because I was kind of interested in, for those people who said almost everyone. Okay, closing the poll in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Here you go. And I'll share
Well, that's pretty
results.
interesting, Karen. It is
a
split, with the exception of under 30%.
Yeah,
Wow,
but
20%
it's split, but
over 90.
the top band is only 10%, and the bottom band
Yeah.
30.
Yeah. But still, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, I really thought it would be higher in this crowd. These early adopters would be in the over 90%. I thought would be skewed much further north, but we are in terms of 43% would be in those top 2 bands.
And then above the professional and managerial employees.
Yep.
I wonder what, so one of the things you might think about as in your organization is, are these numbers true in your rank employees, your subject matter experts, the people actually doing the job? That would be an interesting poll. Next time, maybe we can do that.
Well, one of the things I'm hoping will come of this new addition to the standard is where you said, you pointed out that it now says that objectives have to flow down to the process level. I think a lot of strong companies have always done that. I think the examples that you gave show objectives flowing down to the process level. But I've also seen companies who are just getting started and have real, only at the top level goals. So if they're going down to the process level, hopefully that'll get more people in the ranks, the individual contributors, the hourly employees, to be familiar with their objectives, especially if they get tied to any kind of rewards.
Yeah, I'm also always surprised when I go into an organization at the amount of companies that still do not have dashboards in their organization. And then those companies that have dashboards, but they're not made public, they're not communicated to the organization. So again, I think the standard is pushing us, at least for the quality piece, pushing us to make those objectives, communicate them through the organization, make them understood in the organization so that everybody within the organization has a feel for how they affect quality of product or service that they produce.
I worked with a facility that was getting started with quality. They were a repair facility, small. I said, "What are your quality objectives?" And they said, "Well, everybody cares about how many we produce each day." And they considered their quality objective to be how many products made it off the end of the line. And they had a big board at the end of the line that said, "How many did we make today?" They
Yep.
considered that their one and only quality objective. So we had some work to do.
And if I step back to my matrix here, that's one of the reasons I put that third column in, is I want to force organizations to think through what really is a quality objective versus a financial objective versus a productivity objective. And so this matrix can help you think through those things because they are very, very different. In actuality, for you quality folks out there, and I assume I've got a bunch of you online, a true quality metric is a metric that tells you how well you're doing. It's a metric that marries requirements and process performance. So sigma values are true quality metrics. CPKs are true quality metrics. If you think of percentage scrap, that really is not a quality metric, it's a productivity metric. It's how many we threw away. And so we're trying to drive, and I think the standard is doing that as well, we're trying to drive us to rethink some of the quality measures that we have, or what we call quality measures out on the floor. But that's another discussion. Let's keep going. Let's head on over into our last section, which is going to be documented information. There are some key changes here that we'll highlight on this page for us. Right off the bat, and you're probably already aware of this, there are no required procedures. Those 6 required procedures that were listed in 2008, document control, control of records, non-conforming product, internal audits, corrective action, preventive action, they're not required anymore. Now, does that mean you're going to go out and throw them away? Probably not. They're good business. It makes good business sense to have all of those. At least maybe you do something different with preventive action because that term's no longer around. There is no mention of a quality manual in the new standard. You've probably heard that before. So what does that mean you're going to do? You're going to throw your quality manual away? Probably not, but it's going to be an opportunity for those of you that have 30 and 40-page manuals to do something significant with that manual. And we'll talk a little bit about what that new quality manual may look like and what the purpose of that new document may be. And then, as we've said before, documented information, that term replaces procedures and records. And depending upon the prefix to documented information, we can make reference to one or the other. So if it says maintain documented information, they're generally talking about what we would have considered a procedure. And if they're talking about retaining documented information, they're generally talking about a record. But how you do that, again, is up to you. What media you use, electronic, paper, pictures, whatever it is. It's up to you how that documented information is contained. So let's head on over into the actual requirements. 7.5 talks about documented information, and 7.5.1, as the old point ones are, is general. New wording here, documented information required by the standard. We'll talk about what those are in a minute. And documented information determined by you, the organization, as being necessary for the effectiveness of the QMS. And so the note, it's been here before, it talks about this is going to differ from organization to organization, differ on complexity of the processes, it'll differ on the competence of people. We've always suggested you base your procedures, the detail in your procedures and your work instructions, you base that on education, experience, and training of the folks. And that's what they're referring to in the notes here. So that hasn't changed. If we look at what documented information is required by the standard, so far we've seen we need a scope of the quality management system, we need to have documented information of the quality policy, and we need to have documented information of quality objectives. As we walk through the standard, we're going to run into this retain documented information, which generally is a variety of records that we have. This, I think, these things would be appropriate to put into your new quality manual. If you are thinking of the new quality manual as a document that's going to be useful to your employees, boy, the scope of the management system would be useful to them, as well as the policy and the objectives. So at least having those three in there would be something that your employees could go to, look at, and have a single source of information. Again, whether it's electronic or whether it's written down, I'll leave that up to you. Continuing on into 752 about creating and updating. Not a lot new here. You know, these words have shown up in the old standard. Identify, making sure that the documented information has some identity, some date, some authors, some reference number, whatever it is that you've done in the past. Have a format, you know, whatever that format is, if it's a procedure versus a work instruction versus a standard operating procedure. And then review and approve for suitability and adequacy. These were all part of the old standard, and my guess would be that your specific procedures that show that today would have covered all of these things. So it doesn't need to be a new generated procedure for document and or data control. I think that it works fine the way it is if you keep that procedure, and that's, again, up to you. If we head on into the next section, there's some more 5.3 that talks about control. Again, not a lot of red words here, none specifically. These are all based in the old standard. You know, we want to make sure that the documented information is controlled, available and suitable for use, protected. We have distribution, storage and preservation, control of changes, and retention and disposition. So all old words from the old section 4. And all dealing with control and retention. So your current procedures that you have based on 2008 should be sufficient for you to meet these requirements. And one of the things we're going to tell you to do is to go back and review that. If we continue on, we can look at 2 or 3 more paragraphs or at least sentences that are covered. Nothing new. Again, documented information of external origin. You determine what those are. Make sure that they fit into your document control plan, and then retained as evidence of conformity. We want to make sure that the records are protected from unintended alterations. The note talks about access. How do we access these? And it's a matter of deciding who has permission to look at them only, or permission to review them, or permission to change them. So I don't think you need to do significant amount of work in your document control procedures based on what I've seen in the standard. All right. Karen, I think we've got our last poll.
Okay, let me launch that. This is out of curiosity, what will you do about your documented system? Will you renumber to match the new standard? Will you not renumber, but maybe create a cross-reference? Haven't decided? Or something else, such as a new numbering system entirely? We've seen that there are many possibilities that maybe weren't available in 2000 or early in the century when you set up your management system. People use a lot more search functionality now than memorizing clause numbers. So it'll be interesting to see what people decide to do here. I went into a system and saw it still existed at the original 1987 level. It was a little confusing to me, but it was possible to work for them. Okay, we've got just about everyone voting. I'll close the poll in 3, 2, 1, closing. And share the results. Interesting. What do you think, Joe?
Well, good. I like that 50% of them haven't decided yet, because the next couple of slides we'll have a discussion about it and talk about the pros and the cons of renumbering. 26 of you, a quarter of you, have decided to renumber, and there's some benefit in doing that, and so I'll talk to that. And then 14%, 15% of you have decided to create the cross-reference, so you've made a decision already to do it. 10% of you, that's interesting. I'd be interested to see what the something else would be. So if you want to put a question up there, if you want to put a comment into telling us what you might do other than renumbering, not renumbering, or not decided, that would be an interesting thing for us to play with.
Yeah, you can put that. You can put your comment under the question tab on your screen, and I will not reveal your name, but I'll make sure Joe is able to see that information and can comment on that. We're all
Whenever we
curious
make
what
a
folks are doing.
Whenever there's a revision to the standard, we're always interested to see how it gets interpreted out in the actual companies. And so there's something else I'd be interested in understanding what you might do differently, because it might be a better than we thought about. So I'm always interested in hearing those things.
But one thing I would say as far as renumbering is that especially when a company is combining multiple units or expects to in the future to add units that may have implemented under the new standard, never were familiar with the old standard, that may speak in favor of renumbering if you're using a numbered system. And also, this standard's going to be around until, let's just estimate, 2030. So if you don't renumber now, might it be something you would want to do down the line, and would that influence your decision? But I know you've got a number of thoughts you want to get into the discussion here, Joe. I'll hide these results so you can move on.
Good deal. Thank you. So documented information, that was what we just covered. And the question we want to talk a little bit about is to renumber or not to renumber. That is the question. Do we go through and spend our time renumbering all our documentation so that it meets the requirements of the standard? What's the pros of doing that? What might be the downside of doing that? And so I've listed on this slide a little of both. I'm sure I haven't captured all of them. I'm sure there's other things that we can discuss, but there's a few things here that we can look through. One of the pros, and for those of you that are doing auditing, you're hoping that people are going to renumber them, because if you renumber it, then the procedures match the standard, and it makes it easier for the auditors to find things, both for your internal and your external auditors. Another thing that it does is it forces review of all documents. We have to look at all the documents at least once. And in that review, we can actually decide, do we really need this anymore? You know, there's a whole bunch of documentation out there that we don't need. Every time I go into a company and I look at the stack of documentation they have, I ask myself, is that really necessary? Do we have to have that level in place, not just to meet the quality requirements, but to meet the business requirements? That's really what the standard wants you to do, is meet the business requirements. And so if you're going to renumber, you might as well take a look at the document and decide, is this still needed? Do we have too much detail in here? Could we have less detail and give our operators a little bit more leeway in how they perform the process without affecting negatively the quality of the product or service or the business issues? And then the last one, as part of that renumbering, one of the things you could do is, as your internal auditors go out and do their audits this year, have them do the renumbering as part of their audit process. Have them do the review of the documentation, which they should be doing anyways. Have them make a decision as to whether or not we can eliminate, reduce, or even amend the document that they have there, and then have them tie it back to the clause so that the renumbering can happen as the internal audits are done. So there are some pros to doing this. Some of the cons, time-consuming. For those of you that have done this before, you'll really recognize how time-consuming it is. So I've got the first, second, and fifth thing up there is that it is very time-consuming, especially if you have hundreds of documents out there. It's going to take quite a bit of time. And if you decide to do it, maybe the best approach is the one I've already talked about, and that's have your internal auditors do it. Karen talked about the standard probably staying with us through 2030, and that's based on the past history. Every time they've revved the standard, we've had about 6 or 7 years with that standard. So we would expect this standard to be 6 or 7 years long, and then the next rev, which wouldn't be a major rev, essentially not changing the numbering system, but clarifying some of the things, which is what we've seen in the past too, another 6 or 7. So that gives us another 14 years. Add that to 2016, and bingo, we're at around 230. So this will last you for a while if you decide to renumber it. The majority of it will pretty much stay the same. Not renumbering it, I think that one of the things that would be very, very useful, whether you did or not, was to create a cross matrix and to have on one side of the table the actual standards clauses, and then have the documents that relate to that clause. And so it could kind of like be your master list, but it could also help your auditors understand that if I'm doing this process, I have to look at this clause. So when they do the process approach, they can start picking off which clauses apply to that process. And if you're not doing that for them, when you plan out the audits at the beginning of the year, it could be something that they could utilize. Obviously, it would be a useful thing to have for the external folks, so that when they come in and they say, okay, I want to audit clause 6.2, what procedure do you have associated with that? If the procedure is not numbered accordingly, then that matrix would be something very, very useful for them to move forward with. So I think those are the pros and cons of renumbering. I think for us, and Karen, please jump in here, the bottom line for us at DESARA is whether you renumber or not, one of the things we're going to recommend you do is review all of your documents for applicability. Hopefully you're doing that already. Hopefully that's part of your internal audit. But if you haven't looked at the stack of documents that you have for applicability, now's a good time to do that. Many systems have been over-documented over time, and this major rev is a chance for you to eliminate some of those. It's also an opportunity to have your SMEs more involved. You know, get the folks on the line to do review of their documentation. One of the things we constantly run into is that we have engineering groups or managerial groups writing documentation for the line workers, and they're writing it at the wrong educational level. So having your SMEs review the documents spreads out the work so that you don't have to do it all, and it gets them reading and understanding and maybe even changing some of the wording in their documentation so that it's a lot more readable, a lot more understandable. The old standard told us, the new standard states, remember, you only need to document what you need to document. It's your decision. All right? So if you decide to renumber and you believe it adds value to your system, go ahead and do it. It's not a requirement of the standard. It's not something that the standard is requiring you to do. The standard is also not requiring you to use the nomenclature in the standard. If you want to continue talking about preventive action, feel free to do that. There's no requirement to do away with those kind of words as well. All right. The last thing I want to talk about is, do I still need a quality manual? The standard doesn't refer to one, so technically speaking, you can take your quality manual and do what you've wanted to do with it forever, and that's burn it. But my suggestion is, I think that there's still a use for a document that you might want to call quality manual. And here are some of the things that I think would be in it. I think the purpose of having this new quality manual is that it's a good roadmap for your employees for the quality management system. I have companies today that have 6 to 10-page manuals. They do not mimic the standard back to me word for word. What they have in there are useful documents, or as the new standard calls it, documented information that the employees can utilize, can look at, can access and understand all the different pieces that go into the QMS. And so here's a list of some of the things. Certainly it's not a complete list, but some of the things that I think might be in your quality manual. A paragraph or two of context of the organization. Some of you have missions and vision statements. That gives you a little bit of the context. Maybe a list of these interested parties that we're going to generate and those requirements that we think go along with those interested parties. We've already talked about the scope, the policy, and the objectives being in there, and that sequence and interaction chart that we're going to have as well. Have that in there so your operators, your employees, your SMEs can look and see where their process fits into the overall structure of the company. The cross-reference matrix I just talked about, and maybe even this risk analysis document that 6.1 says we need to have. You know, whether it's a fancy failure mode effect analysis, which most of you probably aren't going to need, or whether it's a simple Excel spreadsheet that talks about the interested party and the risk that they have associated with it. And then lastly, if you wanted to, you could put in there your records retention information, that retained documented information. So from my point of view, I still think there's a use for this thing called quality manual. I think that we need to revamp the 30-page manuals and get rid of all the unnecessary information, and then have this kind of information, documented information, available to our employees on an ongoing basis. All right, what should we do from 7.5? Here's the list of actions. Clearly review the manual and revise it. You know, take this opportunity to clean it up. Review your current document and data procedures. It should be in line with what the new standard has, but make sure it's there. Make sure you haven't forgotten anything. And make a final decision if you're going to renumber or not renumber, and if not, generate that cross-reference matrix. And then look at all of your documentation for usefulness. As has been typical in all the stuff we've told you, make this part of step 3, the high-level plan, and then the specific actions in step 5, so that you can track them and assign them and understand who's responsible and accountable for them moving forward. All right. I think Karen's going to pick it up here as to what's next. We have only a few minutes left, so Karen, I'll leave it up to you.
Right, I'll move quickly. I think we have a lot of people on this call who have, you can go ahead and advance the slide if you'd like. We've had a lot of people on the call who have attended these before. You've seen the slide that says the types of things DESARA is doing. Now that we've gotten into the new year, some of the things that I'm seeing is our clients are asking for 3 main categories. One is training. They want to know, what does the new documents say? What does the new standards say? And they want to know, how do we audit differently? So those are 2 customized training classes that we do for our clients on site, and we also have public training being offered every month in Dallas. There's an enroll button on our website, and you can get involved there. But we customize the classes that we bring on site to focus on those things that are important to you, and you can ask your own questions about those. So we've had some demand for that. Also, we're getting a number of requests for custom workshops, which is a combination of training and applying the standard to your organization. So one, for example, is 1 or 2 days of training, followed by 1 or 2 days of assessment on site, learning to audit more effectively and practicing with a coach versus using the new methods that are going to be needed under the 2015 standard. And then a day of planning with the instructor and coach working with you to say, what are we going to do differently in our organization as a result of this? And we're working in 1 or more management briefing sessions during that week as well. And that can be done in 3 to 5 days, depending on what the organization's size and needs are. And then a third thing we've got is pent-up demand for implementation. Companies that have held off on implementing ISO 9001 until the new standard was out. So we're working with companies on that, and we do integrated on and off-site training, coaching, and skill building through that. So those are some of the things that we're doing. The information is available on our site, and you have my address through what we've done in the emailing back and forth about these sessions. And we really do these as a way for you to get introduced to us, and we hope to work with folks in the future. In the last couple of minutes, I will bring out a couple of questions. I think one of the things that I always hear, and I want to say it here real quick, is people ask for, will there be a certificate for this training? There will not be a certificate, and we don't distribute the slide set because we probably will revise this the next time that we'll present it, and so we just do the recording is out there. You'll get a confirmation thank you for attending if you were on the call. And you'll be able to take that along with any notes that you've taken out of this and present that as objective evidence that you attended. And I think a lot of organizations use that. We had some interesting, Joe, you asked about what were the comments about, well, what do you use if you don't use numbered systems? And if you're not renumbering, a number of people have said, we don't use numbers at all. Here's one answer that said, we've organized documentation so it matches our structure. We have core processes, which are foundational to our organization, functional processes that are function specific, and some cross-functional processes. And our documentation generally aligns with those concepts. And I think that with the ability to search by name and number, that's an example if people were wondering, well, if you don't use numbers, what would you do? But a question came up that I'd suggest that you take, Joe. It was back to slide 23 where you were talking about the example of listing objectives.
Okay.
And
What was the question?
the question was give us more information on dashboards. What did you mean by dashboards?
Oh, sure. So dashboards to me is, how is the company keeping track of how the business is doing? If we go to the automotive industry, a lot of the automotive industries are using SQDCM, safety, quality, delivery, cost, morale. And so they've got metrics in each of those categories that track how the business is doing. So that's all I meant about dashboards. I find still an alarming number of companies that I go into don't have a consistent set of metrics that they look at on an ongoing basis. And that dashboard to me is really critical for the organization to know how they're doing, on an ongoing daily, monthly, weekly, whatever the metric is. And so the goals and objectives matrix that I gave you, these objectives could be part of that dashboard.
It's great. I think what you were saying about the difference in quality versus productivity versus financial objectives, I think that may warrant another webinar, or certainly I know that's part of our training classes that we do on how do you establish good objectives, and then also the idea of, is it okay to have on-off objectives, like one quality objective is to complete transition to the 2015 standard by a certain date, or to offer a new training program on XYZ. So you can have objectives for quality that are, did we do it or not, but you also need to have some that are measurable, or you're well advised to have them that are measurable, as long as all of these link back to these strategic objectives. That's going to be emphasized and what auditors should be looking for under the new standard. Those are the questions that I see that have come in thus far.
There was one, Karen, that I wanted to clear up. Somebody said, is continual improvement not part of the policy? No, it is. I just didn't cover it. If you go back and if you look at 5.2.1D, it says includes a commitment to continual improvement. So it's still there. It was always part of it. I was just trying to focus on the new stuff.
Right. I answered that one with a quote from it in the chat box to that person. And there's one more here that's a real good question, I think, to cover here under documentation. It says, it's my understanding that no risk analysis documentation is required, but probably is recommended. Can you comment on that? And I noticed you listed that under the quality manual would be an example of some place to put that. What are your comments on risk analysis documentation, Joe?
Boy, does this lead into the next webinar or not, huh? Whoever asked that, we should give them some money to deal with it. So we're going to talk a lot about this at our risk analysis webinar. But the fact is that there is no tool. The standard does not recommend it. It typically doesn't. It's not prescriptive at all. What tool to be using to do your risk analysis? My guess would be that small companies are going to use a very, very simple tool. And companies like aerospace companies are going to use FMEA's failure mode effects analysis. From my point of view, it doesn't talk about documented information. So there's not even a requirement that there be documented information as it relates to this risk management. But I wouldn't understand why the company would do risk analysis without having some documented information. So it'll probably be our recommendation moving forward that you have something. Some simple tool. PESTLE is another tool I think that people have been using. SWOT analysis, strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats is another tool people are using. It's going to be interesting from the external viewpoint to see all the different kind of approaches that people are going to take in this risk analysis. So yes, I think that there's probably going to be some documented information you're going to do. We'll recommend that you have it documented somewhere. And then I think it's probably appropriate to put it into the new quality manual. I think it would be a good place for it.
Within our consulting, we have a pretty strong risk management element. It wouldn't be advisable to go through all that effort and not have any kind of written information that explains what we did this year, so that we can go back and update it next year. So while there's no requirement for it, I think everybody except the very simplest organizations would keep some sort of records and understanding of the methodology, so it's a repeatable process year in and year out. And in our system, we do provide the templates and not just a cookie cutter, here's a template, lay it out and use this, but rather going in and tailoring that to the context of each individual organization. What do they need to go through to analyze their risks and to understand what the interested parties need, and to respond to those, as well as the opportunities? So not required, but DESARA, through our consulting practice, is working with our clients on effective ways to document and be able to reuse it year in and year out. I think that's the last question that I saw come in. Let's see. Yes, that's everything and everything else I'll answer privately, or may have. And please, everyone, do stay in touch with Joe and me. You can use the email address on the invitation to this, and if it's directed to Joe, I'll pass that on to him, Karen L. Rawson at DESARAgroup.com. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which will be about 3 weeks from now. And you'll be seeing some publicity for that coming out through the email. If you attended this webinar, you have been added to our mailing list, so you'll automatically get the notification of the next one coming around. So thank you, everyone, for attending. And Joe, thank you very much for your presentation. And look forward to seeing everyone next time.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you all.